In all my years searching for Super Nintendo RPGs to play, there was one that I was continually urged to pass over. I was told that it was irredeemably horrible, but no matter how many times I asked, nobody was able to quantify that sentiment for me. It was just a bad game to be avoided, and that made me all the more curious about it. Drakkhen is an RPG that combines the allure of first-person perspective overworld exploration and a rather off-the-beaten-path combat style. Its roots are on computer systems, and there's no question that this port to the console world would have greatly benefited from the use of the SNES mouse. I'm not sure why more games didn't take advantage of it, but this is one great example of where it could have really changed how the game plays for the better. While I haven't personally undertaken the computer versions of Drakkhen, I have seen a couple of Let's Plays that imply a smoother experience in that form. Clicking on the icons in the user interface rather than D-padding through them, as well as having more freedom to adjust character actions during battles, are just a couple of conveniences that I saw. But even though the Super Nintendo controller is far more limiting, it didn't make the console version unplayable by a long stretch. What it did accomplish is making the game feel totally off base compared to other experiences available on the Super Nintendo at the time. But being different was a shared symptom of all PC titles entering the console market, and not exclusive to this one game. I'd love to hear from anyone that's played Drakkhen on something other than the SNES and whether or not you enjoyed your time with it. Let me know in the comments. In terms of this story, you play as a group of humans traveling around a world of giant scaly folks that are at odds with one another, the Drakkhens and the Draconians. The Drakkhens are magical beings that once possessed 4 pairs of tears representing 4 elements, but the Draconians stole them for themselves. The 8 tears were passed on to a son and daughter of 4 Draconian kings, and your task as a group of fearless warriors is to retrieve them and return them to the Drakkhens. Complicating all of this even further is infighting among the Draconian siblings. They stand divided based on their political leanings and are waging war with one another over the tears. The 2 factions are trying to get them all for themselves, and the instruction manual establishes these tensions well enough. There are a few paragraphs that mention being able to negotiate with the royal children as you decide how to proceed on the journey. You're supposed to have some say in who you befriend or kill, giving the impression that your choices will impact the flow of the game. The reality is that Drakkhen is completely on rails, and this came as a huge disappointment to me. An RPG that has branching plot paths and could yield different results every time you play would be pretty unique, but this was not the case here. The linearity of the story definitely made things easier in the long run, but I thought it was also a missed opportunity for some deeper gameplay elements, especially since the manual even bothered to mention it as a possibility in the first place. When you begin the game, you have the option to forge a party. You can assign either a male or a female to each of the 4 classes, but beyond that, you aren't allowed to change the makeup of your group. The game will roll a set of numbers, and what's neat is that you get to assign them to each stat category as you see fit. Stacking your magic users with more intelligence and pumping your fighter up to higher power values will inevitably give you a better chance of surviving. But if you're a masochist at heart, you can also inhibit each class's boon to give yourself a more difficult journey. For someone playing for the first time, getting totally horrible numbers here might be reason enough for a reset, but for folks that want to experience different levels of challenge, the randomness of these character assignments will bring some welcome variety to each playthrough. How you dole out the stats can really change how the game feels and provide a lot of replay value for future trips around Drakkhen Island. Once you're settled, you're dropped into the world and it's up to you to take the first steps on your long journey. To speak to the different siblings and find the tears, you have to make your way around the Isle of Drakkhen and visit the 8 castles. There's a lovely map in the manual and in-game to help you orient yourself, but traveling occurs from a first-person perspective rather than the more conventional top-down overworlds in other games. I enjoyed bonking into trees and circling buildings of interest, trying to get them to materialize in my line of sight, but admittedly, it did take some practice getting around this way. What's great is that after you finish your first few objectives, you can freely roam almost anywhere you like between the 4 regions of fire, earth, water, and air. The question you have to ask yourself is if you want to. As you might expect, there's an enormous risk in venturing out too far before you're meant to, but Drakkhen brutalizes you more than your average adventure. Typically in other RPGs, as long as you're sticking to the storyline, it's rare that you'll meet a game over, unless you cross a bridge straight into the arms of a waiting wyvern or skip too many fights and end up underleveled. Here though, a bad random encounter or even the map itself can mean your demise, and unfortunately, you won't know that something's a threat until it's too late. There were plenty of times that I ended up dead even when I walked the story path, but as a chronic saver, I never lost too much progress with a full party wipe. It's the innocuous things that get you, like this one occasion where I ran into what I think is a gravestone and it triggered an impossibly difficult enemy spawn. That put enough fear into me to avoid them for the rest of the game. My very favorite way to die in transit, though, was from drowning. If you're maneuvering your party through a swampy area and a fight spawns, you throw down right there on the spot. If any of your party members end up standing over water, they become paralyzed and slowly sink to their doom if you don't run from battle. There are these deliberately microscopic slivers of path between large bodies of water, and the encounter rate on these was suspiciously higher than the rest of the map. At least, that's how it felt to me anyway. I gave up on world exploration early because not only was it punishing, there's also no meaningful way to detour from the main plot. You can't really advance the story out of order, as I mentioned earlier, and as you follow the directives you're given in each castle by the siblings, new places to go will be revealed that must be visited to progress. There's not really much else to do in between that I could find, but when I did go looking, I was always met with roadblocks until I finished my latest task. While it was disappointing to have virtually no extra content outside of the main storyline, in some ways it was a relief since the localization was a bit difficult to follow from time to time. These aren't your usual Japanese to English problems either. The original game text was actually French, which was first localized to Japanese and then later translated to English directly from Japanese text. This makes for a rather philosophical and poetic sounding script where vile beasts spit up flowery language, sometimes with no discernible meaning. I was relieved that most of the important conversations came out well enough that I never really got stuck due to something lost in translation, but a lot of the other messaging was full of holes or downright funny at times. There were many laugh-out-loud moments alongside ones of quiet reflection where I'd be trying to find meaning in what was essentially some weird prose. Apart from the castles, there are a few other landmarks on the map to pay a visit to. The manual describes them as inns and taverns, but they're not like the usual places you'd go to for rest or relaxation. Instead, they house residents that provide you with tips or hints. And while some of this is stuff that you could glean from the manual, occasionally there's a tidbit that's really helpful or something that spurs on the plot. My favorite thing about these stops was the artwork. Seeing something lively and detailed was a nice break from the rather plain first-person overworld view that you see for most of the game. The different characters and their building interiors were fantastic, with my favorites being the shrines where you go to heal up and resurrect your party members when needed. Some of these scenes did get recycled, but most of the buildings in each elemental region had a different aesthetic both inside and out to keep things varied. I can't praise the visual experience without also mentioning the music. There's something so funny about a mean game like Drakkhen having one of the most tranquil soundtracks I've heard on the Super Nintendo. This one and the 7th Sagas get the most out-of-game playtime for me in everyday life. The overworld themes are a joy to have along with you on your walks around the lands, and the castle tracks are dark and uncertain in nature. While some tunes are a little strange, like the one that plays when you run into merchants, most of it instills either a sense of serenity or fear, and all of them fit the bill for whatever you're facing off with in the moment. The day-night cycle was also a nice touch. There's no perpetual daylight syndrome like you would see in the majority of other RPGs, and because you spend so much time walking around and backtracking, changing up the visuals was welcome. Watching the sunrise over the mountains or the sky fade at dusk infused some much-needed visual flair and character to the experience. I really liked how there were some instances where time was actually relevant to advancing the plot, rather than just being a creative decision. It was tied to the story in a couple of places, but even more meaningful was how the battle climate changes in the pitch black of the night. Along with the usual monsters trying to end you, there are even more horrible things waiting for you in the shadows. Depending on which direction you're facing, you'll see different constellations displayed on the horizon sky, and sometimes they'll just beam down to the planet, take on a physical form, and kill you for fun. I didn't see anything in the backstory to explain this phenomenon, but it was both terrifying and hilarious to me every time it happened. The battles in Drakkhen are unlike anything else I've experienced. First of all, the things that you fight seem totally random and not of the world that you're in. I got the feeling that I was in a medieval setting, but you fight stuff like giant rockmen, shadow people, aliens, and the list goes on and on. When you get into a random encounter in your travels, your characters appear from the bottom of the screen and start fighting on autopilot until either they die or the enemy does. You can assign default actions to each individual person, like attacking with a weapon, defending, or using magic, but you have no control over how they go about this in real time. While you can position one selected character if you choose to, effectively switching between the rest to deploy a specific strategy in the heat of the moment is pretty much impossible. Battles begin and end so quickly that there's barely any time to plan, never mind fumble through and find the option to execute it with the D-pad. You have to completely rely on your party members' AI to get the job done, and while this seems like a recipe for disaster on the surface, the majority of the time things actually worked out okay. As my magic users leveled up and learned new spells, I switched them over to some offensive magic instead of melee weapons. This finally helped me get an edge in battle and start winning more reliably, but there was also a huge downside. Because you can only set one action per member, if my magic users ran out of MP in the middle of a fight, they would stop contributing altogether until I manually changed their default battle action to something else. I would have loved the option to set a backup to use in situations like this, but unfortunately it didn't exist. The idea of party members casually burning through precious magic points usually makes my skin crawl, but what's awesome is that MP automatically regenerates as you go about your business. In a game that seems to put so much between you and success, I was genuinely surprised that this was added in at all. The only downside is that the MP meter climbs up at a snail's pace, but I appreciated and used those moments of rest to contemplate what to do next or check over my notes. There's some serious mystery around combat, and even by the end of the game, I was never really able to parse out why some really horrible things kept happening to my party. I've played plenty of RPGs and I feel like I have a pretty good grasp on the basics of the genre, but all my efforts to be prepared with shiny new weapons and armor weren't enough to keep from getting instantly killed from full health or having my equipment destroyed the first time it was put to use. Apart from most battles only happening over a few seconds, there's not a lot of feedback during that time to let you know when the tides have turned against you. You do eventually get healing magic to use, but by the time I would realize that a character was clinging to their last few hit points, it was usually too late to do anything about it. I think to get ahead, it really comes down to making some notes about which monster types do bad things to your party and learn when to run. I escaped from way more battles in Drakkhen than any other game I've played, and thankfully I can't really recall a time when I wasn't able to run when I needed to. Even still, characters did inevitably die and could only be resurrected at those shrines I mentioned earlier. Around the Isle of Drakkhen, things are laid out very sparsely, and like everything else, shrines are never convenient to get to. If I had one or two dead characters, even if it took a few minutes to walk there, I made a beeline for the nearest Anak building and avoided every encounter I could rather than risk a game over. I really liked how there's a stat readout on screen at all times, even down to your character's equipment. When you put on a new helm or some boots, you get to see those added to their avatar, and when they're destroyed in battle, you get to see their choice in undies. I loved this feature, and I wish more games provided inventory insights without having to go digging through menus, and for this reason alone, I didn't mind how large the UI was. Another great feature is that you aren't forced to buy upgrades all the time, since many armaments could be found while exploring castles. There are random encounters with merchants that pop up every so often, but the list of equipment that they carry is so expensive that it's hard to justify purchasing very much. Jade is the currency of Drakkhen Isle, and while you can earn some from every battle one, it trickles in compared to other games. I don't know that I purchased more than one or two things throughout the entire adventure and instead focused on making notes about where I found the free stuff. These items repopulate every time you enter a castle from the overworld, so as long as you don't mind journeying through the rooms and fighting the beasts within on the way, this was the best option by far. The castles themselves were fun to explore and got increasingly more complex as the game went on. Inside, you'd always find characters to chat with, most of which wanted to incorporate you into the menu for some reason. There's lots of lore to uncover in the books and letters throughout the many rooms that you'll saunter through. Even with the light puzzle elements you'll encounter, exploring is very much worth it to round out the bits of story you simply won't get anywhere else in the game. Because each door leads to a static room with potentially several different directions to take, the castles are really easy to map if you're someone that gets lost easily, but I found most of them condensed enough to coast through without busting out the graph paper. Like the inns and shrines you visit on the overworld, the graphics in these places were all unique to the elemental region and gorgeous. There are so many small factors that make these places feel distinctly individual, and it's obvious that a lot of passion went into designing even the darkest, dankest corners of the rooms. Other than my adventurer's clothes blowing up too often for my tastes, the only other substantial hurdle I encountered was uneven leveling. A lesson that I learned pretty late into my playthrough is that you don't gain all-party experience in Drakkhen. The individual that delivers the killing blow gets all the glory, and I had a massively powerful Amazon and two distance attackers that would typically be the ones to seal their enemies' fates. This left my scout Kevin a flabby, worthless party member that spent more time dead than alive. I got so sick of hauling his corpse to the shrine to revive him that I eventually broke down and figured out how to level him up without the others interfering. I had to go back to a low-level area and put all of my other party members on defend as well as unequip them so that Kevin could solo every encounter. Once he had a few levels under his belt, he quickly became the star of the show and morphed into a mighty beast for the late game. I wish I'd known about how characters level earlier on, but at least I was able to overcome this problem with a bit of effort. Even though its reputation is pretty negative, Drakkhen isn't a bad game. I'm honestly not sure why people are so bent out of shape about it, because even with all of its flaws and its difficulty, despite maybe being a nicer experience on computers, it's just different from the rest of the console library. And things that are different take some patience and some getting used to before you can get a familiar level of satisfaction out of them. And there's honestly a lot working for Drakkhen rather than against it. The plot is extremely linear, there's an endless supply of regenerating equipment and MP, and even though you might have to drag your friends' corpses around a lot, there's the ability to learn and be better about when you choose to fight that can mean the difference between life or death. I know that this isn't a game that will ever make a top 10 list for most people out there, but I do truly feel that it's misjudged and underappreciated by folks that just didn't give it enough of a chance before writing it off as a bad game. If your only experience with it was in childhood or as a frustrating and disappointing weekend rental, I hope you'll give Drakkhen another chance someday. It really deserves it.